So these guys came in and conned us that the oil revenues were so short to keep up the Rough Rider scholarships. So we gave them another $350,000 to prop it up, and they immediately went home and had transferred the oil revenues out of the Rough Rider scholarships to create something new.
Mr. Chairman, there's no doubt that the oil royalty monies were declining. However, basically they came in and convinced the legislator to award him $350,000 from that trust fund. They used that for Rough Rider scholarships, except for approximately $73,000 was transferred in from the oil royalty. But then they did, within 2 weeks, establish this new scholarship, and the oil royalty monies were used to pay for this scholarship.
Mr. Chairman, does that fall, was this just a McCallum initiative to create this new one? Oil revenues, or the coaches, or who was responsible for this?
Mr. Chairman and Senator Chrisman, it's hard to understand exactly who, but certainly it was within President McCallum's term as president. I would expect, but I don't know for certain, that some of his team, some of his senior advisors obviously knew what was going on.
Mr. Chairman, I have two questions, and I'll make them quick. Gordy, the number one question is, so an athlete from out of state, they would get a waiver, plus they could get the scholarship along with that. Am I correct in assuming that?
Mr. Chairman, that's correct.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, my second question would be, at the beginning of this whole thing, there was accusations that there was a volleyball student that wasn't getting money. The coach had left. The coach had been fired and sent down the road. And the indication was there was supposedly a slush fund up there. Did they find anything along this line, or was that just rumors? But that disturbed me, and I just wondered if there's anything to that, or is that the rest?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Warner, we didn't find a slush fund or anything like that. Now that could be, as you had indicated, if a volleyball player was there and had one type of tuition waiver, if it was 100% waiver, then what they would get with any scholarship money, that would go toward their tuition, books, room and board, those kind of things. So maybe in some way this volleyball player was wondering why it's not paying for some of that stuff anymore. But we certainly didn't come across anybody that had a slush fund that would be paying those athletes.
Representative Pollard.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gordy, I thought I read earlier here, and maybe you can correct me, I thought the $350,000 the legislature did in 2009 was for operations. And so we're talking scholarships. So are scholarships operations, or do you see where I'm going, or is operations a real general statement?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Pollard, in my mind, scholarships are part of operations. The day-to-day business of the college, that terminology was actually in the law, operations. They did, from the testimony and everything else during the session, we looked and they said there was going to, because their money's reduced from oil royalty revenues, they wanted to get it back up. They wanted to get money into the Rough Rider scholarship. So I don't think there's anything, I don't see anything wrong there that operations wouldn't include granting scholarships to students.
Now, Mr. Chairman, this is just a general statement. Being in business, operations is operations and scholarships are scholarships. To me, that I think it's crossing the line, but that's just a personal observation.
Other questions?
Waivers. We looked at these and we found inconsistent actions were taken by DSU when criteria to meet global art cultural tuition waivers were not met. We also identified a lack of centralization relating to the awarding and monitoring of these waivers, and formal policies and procedures were not established. Global tuition waivers available to international students. The cultural diversity tuition waivers available to students who are enrolled members of federally or state recognized American Indian Nation or Native Alaskan, members of cultural, racial, or ethnic groups which have historically been underrepresented, or individuals whose total family contribution will not exceed 25% of the North Dakota resident tuition from the prior year. The criteria that DSU established for these two waivers, and the first one, the global awareness waiver, you had to have a cumulative GPA of 2, and you had to successfully complete 12 credit hours per semester. The cultural diversity tuition waiver, you had to have a GPA of 2, and you had to complete 24 credit hours per academic year. We identified again that DSU was not consistent in revoking global or cultural waivers when the criteria was not met. We have a couple examples there at the end of that paragraph. Also, while DSU established a 4-year limit on the global awareness tuition waiver, it appears this limit was not applied to all student athletes. Non-athlete students could receive an additional year after 4 years if their appeal was granted. However, student athletes were not required to appeal. Our recommendation over on page 11 is that Dickinson State adequately monitor recipients of the global awareness and cultural diversity waivers to ensure renewals, revocations, and reinstatements are appropriate and consistent. DSU agrees. They're going to review that process and put one in as the acting president has created a task force to review these practices.
Senator Crispin.
Chairman, is the global awareness tuition waiver, it's always capitalized here, is that a DSU thing? And they had some rules and didn't follow them, but it's their rules, so what the heck? Or is this like some kind of a federal program where we're violating something, or what is this?
This is just a Dickinson State program that they come up with as part of their process, I'm sure, to recruit more international students into the student population.
Senator Hank.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gordy, does that mean that no other university, no other schools in the university system do anything like this?
Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, I'm not aware, but that does, they're probably out there, but we're focusing here on Dickinson State. I would anticipate that other universities may have something along this way in order to increase diversity in the student population.
Further questions?
Chairman,
Representative Scarlett.
again, we had a list prepared of all of the various waivers. Some of them are statutory, some of them are institutional, some of them are system waivers. We're going to ask Alan to get a copy of that down for us so that we have it to refer to.
Okay, I'd like to go to page 13, if you don't mind, chapter 3, fiscal related areas, chapter 3, fiscal related areas. In reviewing and reviews performed on expenditures, we identified a number of areas regarding the use of public funds. Examples, the first bullet is use of public funds for employee social type functions. We identified 2 faculty and staff holiday social events totaling over $8,500, 2 faculty and staff picnics, back to school events, which was just short of $9,900, and 2 going away receptions for employees, total of $254. We also noted the use of, in other examples in there, the last one being for football tickets, pregame socials, and the homecoming parade. $6,300 was spent on football tickets, including nearly 1,500 tickets for 5 home football games. We identified $1,770 spent on the homecoming parade and 2 pre-game social events. Now, when we came across these, our initial feeling was that they were a violation of the Constitution's requirement that public funds be spent for public use. When we visited with the State Board of Higher Ed attorney and we went down to our attorney down at the Attorney General's office, they informed us that it appears if the board authorizes an expenditure, a public purpose criterion has been established. There is no formal Attorney General's opinion or court case that was identified, but our discussions with the legal representatives appears this interpretation has been long-standing with the university system. So on the next page, we conclude that while they had legal authority to pay these expenses with public funds, we concluded DSU was not following the principles of proper stewardship of public funds. We cite the State Board of Higher Education Policy 301.8 that, quote, the individuals responsible for spending or approving expenditure of North Dakota University System funds or incurring any reimbursable expenditures must comply with all applicable laws and policies and use good judgment on behalf of the university system to ensure that good value is received for every expenditure, unquote. During our audit there, DSU personnel made comments such as, if the law doesn't specifically prohibit something, or if the Board of Higher Education policy doesn't specifically prohibit such things, then they're legal. They also told us that policies are put into place to identify not what you can do, but rather to identify what you can't do. Obviously, we don't share that sentiment. So our recommendation is that Dickinson State be good stewards of public funds at a minimum, adhere to the Board of Higher Ed policy and use good judgment, avoid unnecessary or unreasonable use of public funds to ensure funds are available for essential purposes, and create and maintain an organizational culture of accountability and stewardship. Management's response is they agree, and in addition to assuring that they are legal, ethical, and effective and efficient, DSU will use good judgment in the types of expenditures that are made and the amounts of these expenditures.
Well, I agree with your conclusion that they should only be able to do what is explicitly stated they can do. Are they required to get approval on a case-by-case basis from the Board of Higher Education on these, or is it pretty much just whenever they feel?
Mr. Chairman, I think that the president would have that authority granted in him as far as, and he would delegate some of that, obviously, to individuals in their areas to approve expenditures.
So were you able to identify any of the line items that, make sure there was no alcoholic beverages and things that are illegal?
We didn't. We looked and we did not find any instances where alcohol was served and paid for by public funds.
Representative Kempany?
Mr. Chairman and Mr. Smith, on these, I'm assuming you probably use unrestricted funds to pay for the, it's public money, but I'm probably guessing that's where. But are they supplanting state funds to keep these unrestricted funds whole and stuff like that? Is there a system to check and balance where they spend, or supplant state, state funds to keep another fund whole? Are you able to track that, or are able to see that type of transaction, or is it clouded enough where you can't really tell?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Kempany, most of the universities, a lot of the universities have a large number of funds, and they're very adamant that they feel they need those funds. Just as a comparison purposes for the committee, the state of North Dakota has probably somewhere between 300 and 350 different funds to do all the activities in the state of North Dakota. UND and NDSU have probably close to 9,000 funds. And now, in a lot of cases, if there's several sources of revenue going into that fund and several expenditures being made out of it, it would be virtually impossible to determine that specific funds were used for a specific expenditure. But we were able to, in regard to your second question as an example, when we talked about that application fee that's required, that $35 application fee, they were using that for a number of different things, whereas we feel it should be used for the expenses of processing an application. We were able to tell that the individuals at Dickinson State who process those applications, they're paid with appropriated dollars. So they're either paid with tuition or they're paid with state general fund dollars. So in that respect, you would have more application fee dollars to spend on something by replacing, by having the appropriated dollars pay for the expenditures this should have paid for.
Well, and see, that is a systematic problem, and I don't think it's unique to Dickinson State. And that's the problem when you look at these unrestricted numbers and look at what's being supplanted, and basically coming from the state dollars, because I'm assuming that they're using tuition dollars, the university system uses tuition dollars, because that's their amounts that they can regulate basically what they get. When they come into the legislature and we appropriate X number of dollars from the state, that's something that is a fixed amount. So they're trying to, it's kind of like this, they try to supplant whatever they can from state dollars then, to keep coming back and looking for more state dollars because there's a certain limit of how far they can go and maintain the unrestricted dollars, and that's what, like I said, this is troubling all the way through, but this has been an issue, this ain't unique and it isn't new. That's been the biggest problem with this.
Representative Scarpel?
Chairman, I kind of apologize, but on the bottom of page 12, Gordy, you kind of skipped over something that I was going to use as a reminder. And you don't need to even comment on it, but it has to do with the National Association of Intercollegiate Athletics. And it made me think about the accreditation process. And at some point in time, I would like somebody, either the system office or Mr. Costin, Mr. Chairman, to let us know when Dickinson last went through the accreditation process, so that we have some idea as to whether or not that should give us some comfort level in the validity of what goes on at these institutions, because it's been suggested to me that that should be one of the criteria we use, that the accreditation process should make us trust that the institution is doing everything appropriately.
I think I read somewhere it's every 10 years. It was done 8 years ago. There's, I think, 2 years.
At Dickinson State.
Something, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that's...
But I would like to get some kind of report on that, because it's my understanding that the whole institution doesn't necessarily go through the accreditation process at one time. The various categories go through at various times, so I would like to know which categories went through the accreditation process when, and also I'd like to know whether or not that accreditation process does in any way take a look at whether or not finances are being handled appropriately.
Mr. Chairman.
Representative Couchner and Representative Merriman.
And President Costin said that he's prepared to answer that. He's got most of that information with him.
Gordy, since they brought back the unrestricted assets question, I'm curious, since you did the performance audit on Dickinson State, did you identify where the other 10 million came from? Of the 2 million, they have 12 million in unrestricted assets, according to this information. And you identified 2 million, and I'd like to know where the other 10 million came from. Did you look at that at all?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Marigold, no, we didn't. That wasn't within the scope of our audit. We just identified that as being related to some of the operations. I'm sure that with time and consulting with the right people, the person would be able to at least generalize where the rest of that came through.
Thank you.
Representative Scarpel.
Just to follow up to Representative Marigold's question, that money typically comes from business enterprises on the campus, such as fees collected for board, for rooms, for parking lots. It's an accumulation of dollars that most typically is reinvested appropriately in the activities of the institution. Most typically, not always. I'm not going there. Most typically.
Mr. Chairman, if I may ask Representative Scarpel a question. If it comes from those business activities, are the costs of those business activities paid out, or is this net of those business activities? Or are the cost of those business activities paid out of this same unrestricted funds, so they're technically not unrestricted funds?
Mr. Chairman, my understanding, limited as it is that it is a type of revolving fund that's used for the money to flow into and the cost to come out of. Okay? But it does provide a place for the monies that aren't otherwise accounted for in the appropriations process to be banked and utilized.
Thank you.
And on back to the accreditation issue, I found what I was reading. It said the accreditation is usually for 10 years. DSU was last fully accredited by HLC in 2005. Thus, DSU is scheduled for a full accreditation review and visit during the 2014-2015 academic year. And it's evaluated based on a set of criteria that are developed and adopted by the HLC board. And I believe there's a visit coming up this weekend by accreditation. Okay. Go ahead, Mr.
Chairman, at the bottom of page 14,
Okay. Go ahead, Mr.
Chairman, at the bottom of page 14, we have a section entitled Ensuring Adequate Funds Exist. DSU's men's basketball team made a trip to China in April of 2011 and played 2 games. According to the men's basketball coach, several attempts were made to cancel the trip due to lack of funding. The men's basketball coach stated the former president insisted the team go. Approximately $65,000 from the men's basketball fund was used to pay expenses for the trip. It appears DSU relied on statements from the former president indicating funds were going to be raised. No such funds were raised. Due to this, at the end of fiscal year 11, the men's basketball fund had over a $43,000 negative cash balance. We identified other concerns related to adequate planning which caused deficits to occur. For example, areas which expend monies, as I mentioned earlier, from the university fee collected from students, they're not provided a specific allocation or a budget. Rather, expenses are incurred throughout the year, and if sufficient university fee monies do not cover expenses, DSU transfers unrestricted funds to cover the deficits. We also had an indication where DSU contracted with a vendor to conduct a seminar. Due to insufficient registration fees, DSU had to use $20,000 from funds dedicated for faculty development, that's an appropriated fund, as well as approximately $9,000 of earned income to cover the deficit. Our recommendation is Dickinson State ensure adequate funds exist prior to incurring expenditures. DSU agrees and they will ensure that adequate funds are in place.
Seeing no questions, move on.
Okay, bottom of page 15, improving funds are in place.
Seeing no questions, move on.
Okay, bottom of page 15, improving international agreements. To recruit international students and establish relationships with the various colleges and universities, DSU entered in various agreements. 2 types of these agreements we'll describe. The first one is recruitment agent agreements. They entered into these agreements with vendors for recruiting international students. In fiscal years 9, 10, and 11, DSU had approximately 5 agreements with vendors for these services. The majority of these payments went to 2 vendors. Both vendors received payments of $2,900 per student or $2,000. The $2,000 was for those students enrolled in the Disney program. Then there were the second type of agreement were memorandum of agreements. DSU and respective colleges and universities in other countries entered into agreements. Payments are made to these respective colleges and universities in addition to the payment made to the recruiter. In our review of information, the majority of these colleges and universities did not receive payments. However, the ones that did, their per student payment was from $150 up to $1,000. In our review of selected payments for recruiters and payments to colleges, we identified concerns related to certain payments. For example, DSU made a payment to a college for 18 students, and only 15 of these 18 were enrolled, which is an overpayment of $3,000. In addition, DSU made a payment on a $2,900 commission payment to a recruiting agent, as well as a $1,000 payment to the university for an individual who did not attend NDSU or Dickinson State. Maybe a Freudian slip there, Mr. Chairman. Also identified in the information in a university system report, DSU allowed individuals to enroll at DSU when admission requirements were not met. We took a look at this for fiscal years 09, 10, and 11, and approximately $1 million was used to pay these multiple commission payments, and approximately $240,000 were payments to foreign colleges and universities for their students. These amounts do not include travel or related costs DSU incurred on trips to other countries to establish international programs or agreements. The students who enrolled under these recruiters were charged respective fees to help cover the commission payments. DSU used appropriated funds to pay for recruiter commissions not covered by the specific student. What we've done on page 17 is we were trying to see if there was a large difference between somebody who came over here, not in the Disney program. First, we took the dual degree students, and we put in there what they were charged, and then we took a resident student who's a full-time student who did not receive a scholarship or waiver, and he lived in student housing for the first year there, as the foreign students are required. If you go all the way down, the total charges, the foreign student is charged almost when all those are paid, $21,000. However, then they look at the global tuition waiver, the payment to the recruiter, the payment to the institution, and payment for health insurance. And if you look at the bottom there, these foreign students, Dickinson State was collecting about the same amount of net cash from these students. On the next page, if you take a look when we mentioned the Disney program, we did the same thing here, and we said that the student lived in student housing in the first semester like the foreign student would have. And if you come down there and add the first two columns and compare them to the second two columns, you'll see that essentially Dickinson would have received less net cash from these Disney students than they would have a resident student who had lived in that dorm for the first semester. Our recommendation is Dickinson State University make improvements with international recruiting agent agreements. If such agreements are to be used, then the university should adequately monitor vendors. They only make commission payments when appropriate, and modify payment requirements to ensure students who have previously enrolled do not require another full commission payment to enroll in subsequent semesters. DSU agrees, and they have severed ties with all international recruiting agents as of this time.
Representative Whittier.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gordy, do we know that, DSU is severing ties with international recruiting agents now. Do we know when they started using those recruiting agents?
Mr. Chairman, my staff tells me sometime around in 2002 they started signing some of these agreements.
Okay, thank you.
Chris Smith.
Mr. Chairman and Mr. Smith, who specifically is in charge of hiring these recruiters? And do you get the feeling that he or she just didn't care in the instances of where we're paying for 18 and only getting 15 and that sort of thing? Or do you suspect that the recruiters were kicking back some money to whoever was hiring them?
Mr. Chairman, first of all, the president would be obviously ultimately responsible, and most of the agreements were signed by him, by the president at that time. And back in 2002, that would have been Mr. Vickers. But they signed that, and I guess what's troublesome to me when you get this, if you imagine this is a contract, any kind of contract, for performance, would be that it would be expected in any business that there'd be some monitoring to ensure that the students you got, met the requirements, especially the English-speaking requirements would have been one. As the university system's internal audit said, that wasn't done. And people were, that were allowed to come over, and you paid for those people. So if it would have been $750 to a university and $2,900, you're paying $3,650 to them. You're collecting $2,750 back. But you're losing $900 per student, and if the student comes and cannot function in English-speaking classes, then there really isn't performance on the contract. Those recruiters have not lived up to what they signed that they would send you.
Mr. Chairman, just a comment. If I go to the bank and get money for 18 grass steers, and the truck comes and only 15 of them get dumped out, if I don't notice that, it's just plain recklessness. And if that kind of thing goes on, when the banker finally figures it out that there's nowhere near as many cattle out there as there's supposed to be, I don't just get to say, well, I'm going to start watching from now on.
Well,
I don't know how.
Were those numbers included in what was presented to the legislature on the enrollment? That's another thing too. We got paid on that.
But clearly, according to this, the recruiters are paid to send X number of students. We don't get that many, and we send them a check anyway. I don't know. We need to
figure out what we do about this, not just say, well, let's quit doing it.
Representative Scarpelli?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gordy, it indicates there's 50 different agreements in your document. And I'm curious, do you have any idea of the timeline when all of those agreements were made? And whether or not the practices that you have monitored in 09, 10, and 11 were part of earlier agreements, or were they part of agreements that the then president made and followed?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Scarpel, we're aware of one, I know we cite one in here where there was a 10-year agreement, but I don't think that the majority of those would have been, they would have been a combination of some of the agreements signed by prior President Vickers and some of them signed by the immediately past President McCulloch.
So if I might say one more. So do you think the practice was different prior to 09? Or would it be your suspicion, and I understand it's probably only a suspicion, that the practice was probably fairly consistent with the prior practice?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Scarpel, it's hard to comment on what the exact practice was. I think there were a lot fewer as far as volume of students that were coming over, let's say in 05 or 06. I think there were fewer of those students coming over than there were when President McCallum took over, and apparently his single focus was enrollment, was increasing that.
Representative Munson and then Senator.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gordy. So the presidents knew this. Did the Board of Higher Ed and the Chancellor approve of this that was going on? Was this something that they were aware of? And was anybody aware higher up that this was happening?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Munson, it's awful difficult for us to say what the board knew or what the Chancellor knew. I would tell you that it's my impression that presidents are given a lot of latitude to make a lot of decisions in helping run the university. And so I'd be surprised if all the details of President McCollum's recruitment of foreign students, if that was common knowledge to the board or to the Chancellor. I'd be surprised if it was, because I would have thought at some point maybe there would have been more discussion on how they're going to do it.
Senator Lee.
Mr. Chairman, I think the important thing to notice is that these relationships have been severed. But I think it's also important for us to keep in mind that this effort, along with the dual credit issue originally, were intended to try to bring students into 11 institutions in our university system at a time when we are on a definite decline in the number of high school graduates that are coming out of our K-12 system in North Dakota. We have fewer high school graduates. We have a lot of colleges and universities. I'm not commenting on the number of those either, but there's a tremendous pressure on each of these to have enough students to keep doors open and provide the kind of environment for the higher education institutions that they want. And the reason I say that is it's many years ago, long before the most recent president was at DSU, that a local high school principal in my area commented on his really strong concerns about the way some of those dual credit classes were being offered, particularly at DSU, in a fashion that allowed them to have credit at DSU but would not allow credit at other places. That's over. I don't want to go into that discussion here. My point is the reason it was done even that many years ago was because of the extraordinary pressure there has been on these various institutions to maintain their student numbers. And in some areas now, of course, the challenge, as we've all read about, is that high school graduates can make a lot of money coming out of high school and going into jobs in an oil patch. They don't have to go and take freshman English right now. So there are market conditions that affect all of this, and it's all part of a longer, broader picture of trying to maintain student numbers in these facilities. And we need to recognize the reality of that as well as part of the cause. It doesn't mean it's right. I'm just saying that was part of what was going on.
Senator Robinson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gordy, in your analysis over the last number of weeks and months, and maybe this is a difficult question, but were you able to grasp any understanding of how deep and widespread the knowledge of these actions were in terms of permeation of the staff? How far down did it go? You know, we hear some people suggest that it was the president only, and yet when you look at everything you're talking about, it seems that this had to go a lot deeper than 2 or 3 people at the time.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Robinson, I mean, obviously in our discussions with staff, and also with our staff surveys that we took at Dickinson State, I mean, obviously, I think one of the driving forces was the immediately past president. However, I would say that it has to, the knowledge of what happened extends a lot farther than the president. I mean, imagine, you know, we've got a section, and so did the university system interim auditor have one where students were given A's. Everybody in the class was given an A. Now that's an instructor, I assume, that's having that responsibility. These various waivers that are given out, I mean, you're including there, you know, the registrar, the office of, you know, maybe Office of Multicultural Affairs. There's 7 enrollment services would be another division, and people have to, you know what I mean, in order for it to progress, it has to have somebody's signature. So people, I think, the number of people that knew about this, I think, was extensive. In order, maybe they didn't approve of it happening, but they didn't say no, and you know, or they didn't. To me, I've talked to some legislators, and I said that, I mean, either they could have contacted a local legislator, they could have contacted someone at the board, you know, at the university system office, or even on the board. I'm saying at some point, but there's a number of individuals that probably did something they shouldn't have done in relation to this.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It seems that, looking at it from the outside, the more we hear that over a period of years, a culture developed, a way of doing business that was not right, but it's the way we do things, unfortunately, and it evolved, and the checks and balances weren't there to bring it to a halt. Thank you.
Gordy, is something like this just a violation of policy, or is something, does this get to a criminal level?
Mr. Chairman, I guess, one, we try never to determine if something, you know, rises to a criminal level. We rely heavily on the Attorney General's office that gives us advice. I'm thinking, you know, most of what I've seen here now, unless, and again, it's somebody's determination farther down the line. If somebody wants to grab this report and turn it into a state's attorney, they can, and then it's a state's attorney decision. We didn't see anything that automatically clicked and said this is some sort of fraud or this is some other deal, mainly because the university system, because of higher ed, has a lot more flexibility. They have a lot more responsibility out there than what a normal agency is that we look at. And in some of these cases, they directly violated a board policy. They directly violated their own policies. And in some cases, they had no policies in that area. It was just, they were just going along as they felt they needed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Mr. Smith. I know we're, partway through this, but I guess the question that I have is, we're seeing a lot of, DSU agrees with, everything the audit, has shown. But what's going to happen now? I mean, they're saying, yeah, we're going to do all of this, but where's the follow-up going to be? The Board of Higher Ed, the Chancellor's office, how are we going to be assured that all of these things happen that they say they're going to happen, and it's not going to continue the way it has in the past?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Bright, I think the first level there would be our office, typically 18 to 24 months after we've presented this, so 18 to 24 months from now, we would go back out there and do an audit follow-up. What that entails is they know we're coming, and we would say to them, here's the recommendations, here's what you said initially, what has gone on since then, that addresses that recommendation. Once we get that correspondence back, we're back out on site, and we're trying to follow up. It's not nearly as extensive as the audit, but we will follow up on the recommendations that are in the audit to some degree to provide some assurance. The second part of that, I would certainly hope that, the University System Office and the Chancellor perhaps would, they've got an internal auditor now. That function, I think, is necessary for them. That they would have, if there's specific things that are maybe a higher priority to the board, that maybe they would direct their internal auditor to go out and sit with the president and his staff to see what they're doing to implement those, to kind of be a second check to make sure that they're staying with it. And there is a lot of agreement in this, and I think that speaks to President Costin that there's no way I would believe that every individual at the university would feel the same as he does about every recommendation. Some of them, I think, they would argue or they would try to defend themselves, but I think he was very cooperative with us throughout the process, and I think that's why they've agreed with all the recommendations.
Any further questions on this section? Seeing none? Senator Hank.
Mr. Chairman and Gordy, what percent of the contracts that DSU enters into was this sample, this 10%?
Mr. Chairman, we really don't have an answer to that. We have later some discussion about the way they procure services and contracts. Their system is pretty decentralized, so they don't all flow through one person who's got all this information. We asked for a list of contracts from Dickinson State, and they couldn't provide one. So we went in the ones that we have. I mean, I don't know that we've ever had a client that couldn't provide you a list of contracts, but they're all decentralized, and somebody in their area was signing an agreement and sending it to the president or sending it out, and nobody had reviewed it.
Continue.
So this isn't the common practice in the university system and the other schools that you've audited?
Mr. Chair, I don't believe that we found this in, our financial auditors have found this in the other colleges. So I would say that those probably have a central person who's kind of your expert, and then the contracts would go through them and certainly through the university system office.
Senator Christman.
Mr. Chairman, I'm not sure what you said, and I'm not sure which of the alternatives is more alarming. Did you say they wouldn't provide you the contracts on snub their nose status, or that they couldn't, that they're just doing business without even contracts?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Christman, it was that they couldn't. Their centralization, they couldn't feel assured. Nobody could tell us. We had contacts with the controller. We had contact people with each of the offices. No one could tell us, I don't know what they would have done. I suppose go to every department, of the college and ask if you've got any contracts and what are they worth. They simply said to us, we can't do that.
So you just picked 10, you don't know what percentage of overall?
Mr. Chairman, we just picked 10 and we found these problems with it.
Further questions? Okay.
Mr. Chairman, I direct you over to page 21. We didn't do anything in that area. I couldn't.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr.
Chairman, higher education is not compensated on a per student basis. So the student numbers have no meaning in the budget process in higher education. Not funded by a per pupil payment scenario at all. That's what is so dumbfounding about why the push for numbers other than status. Very frankly, I don't understand what the urgency was to have tremendous numbers. And even today, the numbers are probably not as credible as we think they should be. If you include, head count, there are a lot of students who are included that are taking one course and counted as a student at that institution. If you go with FTEs as a criteria, it substantially reduces the student numbers at an institution. There are a number of things that need to be considered. Dual credit students are included in the head count. Whether or not the course they're taking meets the rigors the Senator Lee referred to earlier is questionable. So should we or should we not allow an institution to include dual credit students in their student numbers? I mean, these are all things that we need to go through and decide whether or not we want to have an opinion about, or should we leave it up to the board to continue the practices that have been in place? And do we want to have a legislature that's expected to make that kind of effort to fully understand all of the things that are necessary for us to take control of this, as opposed to having a governing entity that manages this system?
Representative Wimrich?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gordy, the classes that where you identify these high number of A grades given, does that include students who dropped the class? And how liberal a drop policy does Dickinson State have?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Lindley, that would not have included anyone who dropped that class. Those numbers where we found 85 out of 85, those would have been students that did not drop the class.
So perhaps, a number of students dropped the class who presumably would have gotten much lower grades.
I guess I don't know that for sure. My in-charge auditor tells me there were not a large number of drops in any of those classes.
At what point at Dickinson State do you know can a student drop a class without penalty, without being recorded as a student in the class?
2 weeks they're given by dropping a class without receiving any sort of a penalty.
And after 2 weeks they would be recorded as having taken the class?
I'm saying that what they would have done was there would have been a penalty for dropping it after that. You maybe would have been shown as
so perhaps a financial penalty. I guess what I'm getting at is, at one time, 100 years ago when I went to college, if you dropped a class after a certain point, you were indicated as withdrawn passing or withdrawn failing or something like that. Those policies have been liberalized considerably in higher education in recent years, and it's not uncommon for students to be able to drop a class even up until midterm and not be indicated as having ever been enrolled.
Mr. Chairman, I guess from our standpoint, I think the way it is now, if you drop that class after 2 weeks, you would be shown just as withdrawing. It wouldn't indicate whether you were passing or failing. It was just that you withdrew from the class.
Okay. And this does not include the withdrawn.
Mr. Chairman, that's correct.
Thank you.
And I don't know why you drop a class that you get an A for just showing up. Representative Mock.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Smith, with regard to the letter grades and the high number of A's, where did distance education fit into this? Were any of those courses audited for grade inflation?
Mr. Chairman, those were not included in our review of the evaluation of the grades.
And do you have a percentage of the number of courses that are distance education versus traditional courses?
I wouldn't have that now. Perhaps somebody from the university system could answer that.
Thank you.
Any further questions on this area? Seeing none.
In the middle of page 23, during a review,
Funding their performance level, is there some kind of a criteria?
Mr. Chairman, I guess I don't know. I would say that we interviewed the former president. He certainly didn't give us any information relating to that. Obviously, the university system does have a performance report where they have certain standards, and then they accumulate those and issue that report. But we do not know specifically why that was done. Again, at top of page 25 with visas, and there were no changes made to this database went for this individual. Another student we looked at had a cumulative grade point average of 2 for 3 semesters, 2 of these 3 semesters, the student completed less than 12 credits as required. Former president approved 2 of his 3 appeals. No information was updated on the database. DSU representatives stated to us that their policy was, their informal policy was to give several chances to the foreign students. No federal requirements identify how many chances a student is to be given. If a student is terminated from this federal database, the student's visa will be revoked. While a student may be terminated from the database, from the federal database, meaning they should not be in country, DSU did make the point that they don't have the authority to remove such individuals from the university and has to allow individuals to enroll. Our recommendation is that Dickinson State take appropriate action when visa requirements are not maintained or met. DSU agrees, and they state that there's not a nationally agreed upon interpretation of the Code of Federal Regulations in this area, and that they're going to establish an internal policy for their guidance.
Senator Lee.
Mr. Chairman and Mr. Smith, do the feds have any requirement that the federal database or the university inform immigration and naturalization if this happens, since they aren't supposed to be in the country?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Lee, I mean, the federal government in the CFR, the Catalog of Federal Regulations, would have something in there that if they're not meeting these, then they should be removed from the CBIS database. And then once they're removed from the CBIS database, then again, it's up to the federal government as to, because their visa's been revoked, as to how long that would end up being until somebody came and told the person they had to be deported.
Continue.
Just a follow-up, and I'm sure it's not part of the audit, but in the